go to your site, do a web accessibility check, make sure that you're still meeting those standards. So it's something that has to continually be worked on. So definitely trying to get ahead of it now is going to put you above your competitors, and it's easier to stay on top of as your site evolves.
Hey, Caitlin, glad to have you here on the show today.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to chatting about accessibility today.
Yeah, me too. I feel like this one's been sneaking up on some people, this topic. So I think it's important that we kind of dive into it. And I feel like there's a lot here. So hopefully we can kind of condense it for people on like what are the top things we really need to prioritize urgently. But before we get into the whole web accessibility topic, I guess tell us a little bit about your background and, have you always been interested in development and, coding and stuff like that?
Sure. So my path to web development wasn't really a straight line. I studied journalism in college, and during my senior year, our journalism program offered an introduction to web development class. So that's where I first kind of got my feet wet in web dev. After college, I ended up getting into marketing. And at my previous jobs, I was always responsible for managing our company's websites. And I just became really curious in wanting to figure out how those sites actually worked, and how to manipulate the code beyond what you could do within the bounds of the CMS. So I ended up going back to school to study web development and design. And I love how my marketing background and my web dev training have kind of merged together here at Builder Funnel, and I can use that marketing knowledge in my job as a developer here.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, that's definitely an interesting path. Journalism is pretty different from, coding and development, but to
Yes.
your point, like that's not a common, overlap in terms of background and everything. And yeah, I mean, I think you see that a lot with just software sometimes where you get
Mhm.
developers that like they're really good with code, but then if you don't understand the context of who's going to be actually using the end product, then some of that gets lost in translation. Do you see that happening?
Definitely. And I think that's, like I said, being able to pull from my marketing background, I have a better understanding of who's using our product and how it needs to function and perform for them. And I think in terms of accessibility, like understanding the types of people who are using your website and what disabilities they may have is so important with accessibility, so that you can make sure that you get that right.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I feel like with websites we could go a million different directions. So for today, we're going to kind of focus in on really ADA accessibility and why that's so important, but then also like how it pertains to legal and Google and rankings and all this fun stuff. So maybe let's just start at the top. How do you actually define it? What is this?
So, simply put, web accessibility just means that people with disabilities are able to easily navigate and interact with websites, apps, and any other like digital tools or platforms. There are all types of people with disabilities who use the web on a daily basis. And so those digital tools and websites have to be able to accommodate these people. And there are several different types of disabilities that people may experience. So I'll walk through those quickly. People could experience visual disabilities. People who are blind, they might use screen readers, and screen readers are actually devices that read the content on a web page out loud to the user. People who are colorblind may struggle to see content on a website if there isn't high color contrast between your text and the background colors. There are also cognitive, learning, and neurological disabilities. So people with these disabilities, they might struggle to navigate a site that is really complicated or functions outside of the norm of how websites typically function. And they might struggle to understand like a lot of large chunks of text that aren't broken up into sections. There are auditory disabilities. So people with auditory disabilities, they may rely on captions and volume control to view videos on a website. There are physical disabilities. So people with physical disabilities may use hardware or software like a keyboard navigation, a mouth stick, or voice recognition to browse websites. And they might have a hard time clicking on small elements on a website. So that would be like social media icons that are really small. Those are hard for people with physical disabilities to click on. There are also speech disabilities. So people with speech disabilities, they struggle with websites that only offer one way to contact a business, like a phone number. So it's really important to offer multiple ways to contact your business through email, through a contact form, and then also a phone number for people. And one thing I do want to point out is that web accessibility also benefits people that have temporary or situational disabilities. So people who might be in a situation where their internet connection is not really great at that moment, or people who aren't able to play the audio aloud on their videos because they're sitting, in a doctor's office waiting room, or even a person who has a broken arm and just needs assistance for a few months.
Yeah, that's definitely a longer list than I was anticipating, and we've been
Mhm.
talking a lot about this, over the last few months here. And it almost feels like, in the physical world, I don't know when it happened, but we went through a wave where I'm sure all of a sudden that's when all the ramps, started going to place for people with wheelchairs and, all these things in kind of physical spaces. But it probably took a turning point. So it almost feels like we're hitting a turning point in the digital world now. I guess, from a marketing perspective and people listening, remodeling business owners, and maybe this feels like why are we even talking about this? So I guess why are we bringing this up? Why do we feel like this is important? And then contextually to our audience in residential construction.
Yeah, so that's a really great question. I will say that it is sort of gaining momentum in the web world in terms of making sure websites and digital tools are accessible for everyone. Some of that has to do with actual laws that are being implemented, which I'll definitely dive into that. But I would say, first and foremost, this is super important for all business owners, anyone who owns a website or has a website, because it's just the right thing to do to have an accessible website that everyone can use and access. The internet is a part of our daily lives. We use it for everything from buying groceries to getting medical help to finding a home builder. And everyone really deserves that same access to all of these resources that are available online. But there are also benefits as a business owner to have an accessible website. So accessibility and usability. So usability is kind of a hot term that you might have heard of as well. They really go hand in hand. So the practices you put in place on your website to improve accessibility are also going to improve just overall ease of use for all customers who are using your site. So accessibility standards really benefit all users, not just those who have disabilities. Also, going off the idea of a better user experience, having an accessible site also boosts your SEO. So all of the best practices you implement to improve accessibility are going to improve your SEO. And Google has made it very clear that websites that provide users with a better experience and are meeting accessibility standards are going to be more visible in your search result pages. So that's super important to make sure that you're getting visibility in Google search rankings.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting because going back to, I've been in kind of the digital marketing SEO world for about 11 years now. And there's a couple interesting things. One is Google is always changing, and
Mhm.
they're always changing all the little details and everything. But on the flip side, they're always staying the same in that if you think about your SEO strategy, all they care about is getting the user an amazing experience and delivering them the best result as fast as possible. So it's funny, like
Exactly.
as you are describing these things, like getting into the weeds of like it's user experience and it's better for everybody. And, it's like, oh, yeah, logically that makes sense. And then in Google's eyes, a site that prioritizes that is going to be more valuable than a site that doesn't, because it's faster, it's simpler, it's easier to use, it's all those things. And this is just like a big piece of that. Is that kind of how you see it?
Yes, that's exactly right. Accessibility is one big part of all of the things that Google wants your site to do. And making sure your site is accessible is just going to make Google happier, as well as your users happier as well.
Yeah. Yeah, they tend to go hand in hand. I mean, as long as Google still like has that as their focus, is because nobody's going to use Google if it doesn't return sites that are actually functional and have the right information and what you're looking for. And so if you kind of go back to their intent, it has to be in line with the user. Otherwise, nobody wants to use their browser. There's a bunch of other ones out there that you can, use. So, or
Exactly.
their search engine. Go ahead.
Yeah, one more point for business owners about why you should care about accessibility. Um, by making your site accessible, you're also going to be able to reach a broader customer base, because now more users coming to your site are going to be able to actually navigate and use your site and find the information they're looking for. So just having an accessible website is going to put your company ahead of your competitors whose websites might be harder to navigate for people who have disabilities. So that's a huge benefit. You're able to reach more possible customers by focusing on accessibility.
Yeah, that's huge. And you mentioned a little ways back, kind of the legal aspect. Like there's some laws coming into place around this, and that's one thing that's prompting all of this discussion, among web developers and marketers online and everything. So what are kind of some of these high level laws that are coming into place, or what should we be aware of if our sites aren't accessible right now?
Yeah, so the legality of all this can get a little bit muddy, if I'm being honest. But under
Yeah, and
the
just a disclaimer, this is not legal advice, like
yes,
but
definitely
we'll dive
not.
into it. Yeah.
Yeah. So in the US, web accessibility falls under Title III of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And that basically states that you can't discriminate on the basis of disability in the activities of public accommodations. So our court system has basically interpreted that law to include the web as a public accommodation that everyone has a right to access. We have seen a steady increase in the amount of lawsuits. And when I say me or we, I mean the US, in the amount of lawsuits in the past years that individuals have brought against website owners for not having a website that's accessible. So if someone tries to access your site, they have a disability and they're not able to use your site because it's not meeting accessibility standards, they can actually sue you for not complying with the ADA. Like I said, this is where it gets a little bit muddy because the ADA doesn't detail exactly how to comply with website accessibility laws and
So
what
they're still
exactly
trying
your
to figure
website
it
has
out,
to have.
basically.
Right. They're still trying to figure out. It basically says your site needs to be accessible, but we don't have exact standards for what that looks like. Luckily, there are some guidelines that have become kind of the standard. So there is a international group that kind of sets standards for the whole web, and they've created the Web Content Accessibility Guideline. And this is kind of a recognized set of guidelines for what is accessible. What does web accessibility look like? And our courts have kind of recognized this as the working standard for accessibility. So web developers, we rely on that guideline when we're making sure a site is accessible.
Yeah, that makes sense. And we can link that up in the show notes too for anybody that wants to kind of take a look at that. So I guess in terms of like if I'm listening to this, I'm just thinking, okay, so there's some changes coming about through the web and I need to pay attention to them. It sounds like there's maybe some lawsuits that are starting to fly around, and so we need to start working through this, making sure our websites are up to the standards. Are there like timelines that we should be shooting for, like for when to get this done? Obviously there's a risk component if
Mhm.
somebody hits your site and they feel so obliged to be like, hey, this wasn't up to standard, I'm gonna take you to court or whatever. But are there any timelines floating around for like when sites need to be starting to resolve some of these things?
So there aren't any hard deadlines or timelines, but from my research, I found that there is a push to have the federal government actually formalize and standardize these web accessibility standards. Uh, I think most people are under the assumption that when the federal government does that, they will make that web content accessibility guideline kind of the set requirement to meeting accessibility. So like I said, there isn't a hard deadline, but it's the expectation is that this will happen fairly soon, that the government will set these standards in place.
Yeah, and I feel like with all these things, like it just depends on your risk tolerance and how much urgency you have behind your own um I guess initiative there. But generally I've found that like trying to be early on these changes benefits you because you get in faster than your competitors, you start fixing a lot of these things, and then when stuff actually does like click into place, then you're not scrambling, you're not going, oh man, here's this deadline and I'm way behind. And you might still discover that you didn't do it all the way, and so then you just got 10 or 20% more to work on and kind of get to the finish line. So that would be my recommendation, is just kind of like becoming familiar with this. We'll drop some links as additional material, but then starting to be proactive around it.
Yeah,
Yeah, go
I
ahead.
think you make a really good point. Web accessibility, it's not something that it's not like one big project that you can just tackle and be done with it. There are pieces, components that you can obviously get out of the way, but your website's always changing and evolving. So you do really have to stay on top of it. And it's important to, every 6 months or every year, go to your site, do a web accessibility check, make sure that you're still meeting those standards. So it's something that has to continually be worked on. So definitely trying to get ahead of it now is going to put you above your competitors, and it's easier to stay on top of as your site evolves.
Yeah. And Caitlin, if somebody's listening to this and they're going, okay, that sounds great, how do I check to see if my site is compliant, or where the gaps are? Is there an easy way to do that, or is there kind of a process around that?
Yeah, so there are a ton of great free resources and tools online that you can run your website through to check for accessibility, or you can check your color contrast, your heading structure on your pages, things like that. So definitely Google web accessibility tools or resources and use some of those free sites that are available. One tool that I really like is called Wave. You can find it at wave.webaim.org. And you enter your site's URL, and it basically flags any accessibilities on your web pages. And you can go through one by one and see exactly what you're being flagged for and how to correct those issues.
Nice. Yeah, so I think that's an easy action item from this conversation, is just go drop your site in a tool like that, and see what comes back, and then
Mhm.
you'll have a starting point. And you kind of mentioned it's not like a one project and you're done. If somebody ran their site through something like that and they're like, great, I know everything, and they kind of fix everything, why is it something that you would have to keep going back to like every 6 months or a year, like you mentioned?
So it could be things like, every time you add an image, you need to make sure that you also have alt text for your images. Or every time you create a new page, that page has to have a page title. And I think sometimes just in the process, those small changes, small best practices can kind of slip through the cracks. So just running your site through some of these tools can flag those little issues that maybe were overlooked in the process of adding new pages or updating content on your site.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. And we see that so often. It's like you said, websites are evolving, they're always being worked on. If you're using them properly for, marketing, like you're adding blogs, you're adding pages, you're adding photo galleries, like you're doing all these things. And so yeah, you think, oh, it's just throwing some text or throwing some photos up, but there's a lot more nuance to those steps, like labeling the images for somebody that maybe can't see images. And so they can read images if there's some description there and things like that. So I think that's a great point. So we've been working on some things this year, kind of unrelated to this, but also related to this, now incorporating, these kinds of components, I guess. And I know you've been a big part of that. So maybe you can just share a little bit of what we've been working on this year to kind of help solve some of these things that are coming down the pipeline.
Sure. So here at Builder Funnel, we're always trying to stay on top of any new guidelines or standards that come out around accessibility. When we do any work on our clients' sites, we're making sure that we're implementing those best practices, like including alt tags and page titles. We recently launched a masterclass, a UX masterclass that includes a section specifically about web accessibility. So definitely check that out if you want to dig deeper into this topic. And then we also offer web accessibility audits, so we can review your site and help get your site up to the appropriate standards if you're not meeting them currently.
Yeah, that's awesome. And yeah, if you want to check out that class that Caitlin just mentioned, you can just go to builderfunnelacademy.com/join, start a free trial, and then you'll get access to that course, and you could watch it during the 14-day trial and cancel if you want. But once you get in there, you'll probably want to stick around, but that class is available in there. Caitlin, what have we not talked about with this topic that you want to make sure we get across to everyone listening?
I think we've really hit on the big points. I will just stress again that, it can be easy to think like, well, that's not really the clientele that I serve. I don't, work with users who maybe have disabilities, but don't forget that there are a lot of different types of disabilities. There are temporary disabilities, and by accommodating all of, everyone with any sort of disability, you're just broadening your customer base. So that's a huge benefit for you and for your business. So definitely take this seriously. Use the free tools that are online and try to make, even if it's just small changes here and there on your site, try to implement those as best as you can.
Yeah, I think that's good advice. And I mean, even for me, I've been in this, I would say, next to it, not deep in the weeds like you have been. That list that you rattled off right at the beginning of all the different, I mean, I didn't know about a lot of those. And so I think that shows you that if you're kind of trying to solve for all of those things, you're broadening the scope of who you can help and who you can serve in your business. Well, Caitlin, thanks for sharing your thoughts and your expertise on this topic. If you're a listener of the show, we're going to end with our fast five. So I'm going to hit you with 5 rapid fire questions and just say whatever comes to mind. So favorite business book and why?
Okay, I'm going to cheat a little bit. So this is a personal growth book rather than a business book, but I recently read Atomic Habits. I don't know who the author is off the top of my head.
James Clear. Yeah.
Okay. And I loved this book because it gave like really concrete tools for how to set goals and build habits, which I think a lot of like books around habits skip out on. So I loved that it was just like small takeaways that you could implement immediately.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. Who is the most inspirational person in your life?
Okay, also going to cheat on this question. So I'm a military spouse, and I'm going to say that I'm always inspired and amazed by our military spouse community and other military spouses, just for being like so resilient and adaptable and dedicated to the cause. And I'm just, like I said, always inspired by this group.
Very cool. Very cool. All right. If you could have one superpower, what would that be?
I'm really torn here. So I think teleportation, because we travel to see family a lot. So it would be amazing to just teleport all over the place and not have to deal with long travel days and jet lag. But I would also say the ability to be fluent in like every language,
Mm.
because that would make traveling and interacting with people just amazing.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, I know it's tough to choose just one. It's like, can we just do some superpower stacking or something? Like pick three. All right. Describe yourself in 3 words.
Okay. I would say dependable, structured, and genuine.
Right on. All right. Final question. If you could leave our listeners with one piece of advice, what would that be?
Um, Kind of just repeating what I said earlier, like all of this can feel super overwhelming in terms of accessibility and making sure your site is accessible. And you might be thinking like, where do I even start with this? But keep in mind it's an ongoing process, so you can make little changes here and there, and then kind of tackle the bigger problems when you're ready. And just always remember that your site's going to evolve, the internet's always evolving, and so there are tons of resources out there to help you with this. And of course, our team here at Builder Funnel is happy to help as well.
Yeah, good advice. Put one foot in front of the other and just keep repeating that stuff. So,
Right.
all right. Well, Kaylin, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.